Welcome to the Virtual Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester, and I'm the Director of Hammer's Public Programs, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our lecture series, Rembrandt Here and Now. Today is the fifth lecture on the artist Rembrandt van Rijn by art historian John Walsh. In this series of 6 talks, Walsh is discussing Rembrandt's drawings, paintings, and etchings, with a focus on works that are in Southern California museum collections, including the Hammer Museum. Last week, we heard about the many self-portraits Rembrandt made, and one of the audience members sent us a link to a YouTube video where his self-portraits are transposed on top of each other so you can see his face changing over time. And it's pretty cool, so I'm adding a link to the video in the chat below in case you'd like to see it. But for today's talk, we're pivoting from Rembrandt's self-portraits to the portraits he made of classical heroes, gods, and saints, including the Hammer Museum's own spectacular portrait of the Roman goddess Juno. The focus is on Rembrandt's works from the late 1650s, when he was painting many commissioned portraits of patrons and officials as well. So allow me to introduce our guide, the renowned art historian John Walsh. Walsh was the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum from 1983 until 2000, and prior to that he was a curator of painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Walsh taught art history at Columbia and Harvard Universities and currently teaches part-time at Yale. Walsh is the author of many articles and catalogs of Dutch paintings of the 17th century and of several books, including the J. Paul Getty Museum and its Collections, a museum for the new century. He currently serves on the boards of the Hammer Museum and of the Yale University Art Gallery. Next Sunday at 2 o'clock, Walsh will talk about Rembrandt's final paintings and how their power has transcended time and culture. So please be sure to come back next week, and you can RSVP on the Hammer Museum website. And if you want to view even more art history talks by Walsh, he gave a wonderful 3-lecture series at the Hammer on Vincent van Gogh last year, and the videos are currently available on the Hammer website as well. And please stick around at the end of today's presentation, and John will be happy to take audience questions, which you can submit via the chat window on your screen. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Walsh.
Thanks very much, Claudia, for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure to welcome you all back to this series of talks. They're coming to you not from the wonderful Hammer Museum, which I can almost see out my window, but instead, in these weird times, from my cluttered study at home, not far away. In this series, we're looking at Rembrandt's whole career, taking up a few points of view that may be revealing for you. We're paying particular attention to the many pictures that you can normally see live and in person in the museums of Los Angeles. That's the here, in the here and now of my title. The now emphasizes the additions that have been made in more recent years to what we know and what we think about Rembrandt. In the last talk, we looked at Rembrandt's self-portraits, which he made all during his entire career of 40-odd years. Today, we're going to look at work from his later career, particularly pictures that actually commissioned by his various patrons. I'm going to deal today mainly with just one decade, beginning in the mid-1650s, when he was a celebrity in the Netherlands, and on account of his etchings, all over Europe as well. This was a time of financial and personal troubles for Rembrandt. He was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1656. The distinguished Amsterdam house that he'd owned for 20 years had to be sold. His art collection and much of his property as well were auctioned off, and he moved to a much smaller rented house in an undistinguished neighborhood. All that actually hardly surfaces in his work, though. It was a time when he made some of his greatest paintings for clients who understood his strengths. I'm going to talk about this familiar picture in some depth, but first I'd like us just to look at it and a few details for a minute or so. We see 5 men with hats and a 6th in the back without a hat, all in a paneled room with light coming in softly from the upper left. They are positioned to seem a little higher than we are, looking down, as though they were on an unseen platform. The paneling in the room suggests why. The picture was probably painted to hang in a room like this one, well above the paneling. The bareheaded man is a servant. It was a custom for gentlemen to keep their hats on for portraits. And these are not just any gentlemen. These are the officials of the Amsterdam Guild of Drapers. They were cloth merchants. Their duty was to grade and certify the quality of cloth produced in Holland or imported. So tedious work, you might think, but it was important. A lot of money and prestige rode on their judgments. Tedious to paint their portrait, you might think, like photographing the Supreme Court justices or the LA County Board of Supervisors. But Rembrandt managed to give the picture quite a lot of variety and excitement and even surprise. Their heads aren't lined up evenly, but irregularly. Their poses are not relaxed, but energized, as though they needed to assure us of their reliability. Their sober, identical costumes elevate them socially and unify them. The man at left of center has a big book open and he gestures to it, inviting us to inspect it. It's the proverbial open book. These men are not there as mere individuals, but as a group, one that bears a public responsibility. They're shown as serious men, serious, but we shouldn't take their expressions as gloomy or moody. In fact, their emotions were of no consequence to the fellow citizens for whom the picture was painted and whom it was supposed to impress. Nevertheless, there are some powerful individual portraits, maybe none more than the man who's in the act of rising and giving a kind of urgency to the portrait. His name was Volkert Jans, and Rembrandt wanted to get him right, as you can see from the preliminary studies. In the messy drawing at the top, he tried out poses for the trio at the left-hand side. Volkert Jans stands in the middle and looks down at the book. Then, in the bottom drawing, Rembrandt had a better idea. He'd have Volkert looking at the viewer. And then, while he was painting the picture, he changed the pose again. The X-ray shows multiple heads, a few more heads than we see now. Second from the left, with the arrow, there is Volkert standing, but we also see him a second time, the dramatically rising figure that we have now. He painted it over the standing one, but it's visible in the X-ray because there's a lot of lead white in it, and lead is mostly what blocks the rays and shows up in the film. Rembrandt does something here that no painter of a Dutch group portrait ever thought to do. And by now there were dozens and dozens of such pictures. That is, he makes everybody look at us. And that gives an intensity and a connection to the viewer that not even Rembrandt had tried to achieve in his breakthrough commission just 30 years earlier, the members of the Surgeons Guild being taught anatomy by Dr. Nicholas Tulp. A couple of men in the back look at us, but the others are looking towards their teacher or towards the cadaver, or else the book at the lower right. Each of those things that define what the picture is about, which is the transmission of knowledge. This painting is about accountability. Accountability to the Guild for exercising expert judgment, and to society for the quality of the cloth that was a commodity essential for Dutch prosperity. They present themselves as uncorruptible. None of them avoids our gaze. In fact, they do the opposite. One of them, our friend Volkert Jans, with the unforgettable head, seeks us out as he rises, seeming not to just meet our gaze, but perhaps to challenge us. The individual heads project alertness, and they hint at complex personalities. You can see everywhere how the brushwork varies too, depending on the work that it's performing, building up flesh tones with careful touches, or describing the highlight on a fold of black cloth with a couple of fluid switchbacks of light gray. The paint is built up in patches to suggest the texture and the weight of the carpet on the table, or it's scumbled to suggest the pattern woven into it. The white edges of the pages are dragged over the canvas and just crumbly. But for the men's hands, the paint behaves quite differently. Rembrandt applies it with effortless liquid strokes. For the sake of comparison, here are a couple of contemporary group portraits. One of them you probably know, the governors at the left of the charitable institution in Haarlem, painted by Frans Hals. Hals gets credit for injecting life into this unpromising type of picture, and I think Rembrandt must have known this composition. I think he must have liked the way Hals varied the spacing of the men's bodies and their heads, but Rembrandt decided to keep everybody behind the table, and he changed the action, directing it at the viewer. And of course, he painted about as differently as you can imagine, with broad areas of light and shadow to give an illusion of 3 dimensions, and painting wet paint into wet paint, leaving the marks of the brush visible. Rembrandt's buildup of paint is thicker and richer and more translucent and more varied. This is a way of working that he taught pupils, such as Ferdinand Bol, who became very good at it. But then in the 1640s and 50s, when taste changed in favor of a smoother, blonder, more elegant painting style, Bol went with the new taste, which is where patronage lay and where he prospered, while Rembrandt continued in his own direction, as you'll see. Bol helps you see what Rembrandt did with the formula. Where Bol cropped the scene tightly, Rembrandt let his group breathe in a bigger room. Where Bol has his men doing the conventional thing, which was to look every which way, Rembrandt gives his action more cohesion. Here are the 3 men at the far left in each of the groups you've been seeing. Hals's man on the left is consistently fluid. Rembrandt's at the right, rough and vibrant. Bol in the middle, smooth with a taut skin and well-groomed hair. The features of Bol's man are sharp, and the likeness is probably good, though there's not much complexity evident. Despite that, his lighter, tighter portraits of people, pictures that made them look suave and better mannered, were evidently what much of the upper bourgeoisie and regent class preferred. Rembrandt bucked that trend in the 1650s, right through to the end of his life. There were important patrons for him, nevertheless. After the Night Watch and before the Syndics of the Drapers Guild, there had been another group portrait. In 1656, the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild commissioned another anatomy lesson with members looking on, this time conducted by Dr. Johan Deman. That's what you see of it here on the right, a fragment in the Rijksmuseum. It's all that's left after a fire in 1723. Luckily, Rembrandt made a drawing of it, complete with its elaborate frame, showing 10 figures, not counting a cadaver who was a 21-year-old Flemish tailor and criminal named Joris Fontaine. There are indications that above them, there was a great high room with an arched ceiling. And here I've outlined the surviving fragments in blue, so as to show you how much was lost. What we have left is an attendant surgeon at the left, Dr. Gijsbert Kalkoen, in an elegant pose, holding the top of the skull that Dr. Damon removed before he began to dissect the brain with those skilled hands. And we have the corpse, stunningly foreshortened, which recalls Renaissance exercises in perspective, starting with Mantegna's Dead Christ, which Rembrandt didn't see, but he may well have come across this contemporary Italian etching and took up the challenge. Rembrandt's composition was symmetrical, and his picture space was high and narrow, shallow, reflecting his interest in the compositions of the High Renaissance. Very different from the anatomy lesson of Dr. Taupe, which is irregular and agitated. Both these paintings hung upstairs in the Surgeons Guild headquarters there in the Waag, way house that had been a medieval gate and now has quite a nice cafe out front. Rembrandt's third public commission in these last years was the biggest, the most prestigious, the most conspicuous of all. Not a group portrait, but a history painting picturing an event described in the histories of Tacitus, the 2nd century Roman writer. I'm showing you a picture taken a couple of years ago when it was lent to the Rijksmuseum, just to give you a sense of scale. The figures are over life-size. The picture is now in Stockholm, where you can see it a lot better than Rembrandt's audience ever could. The subject is the oath-taking of the ancient Batavians, who were the ancestors of the Dutch. They were a Germanic tribe living along the Rhine during the Roman occupation of their territory. They were barbarians, as the Romans called them. The Batavians were incited to rebel by a Romanized German warlord called Gaius Claudius Civilis. They met in 69 AD in a sacred grove, and they heard Civilis give a fiery speech. Tacitus says that Civilis was able to bind the whole assembly with barbarous rites and national forms of oath. The Batavian revolt lasted only a year and was finally put down, but the story about it in Tacitus never died in the Netherlands. Up close, the painting makes a staggering impression of roughness and sketchiness. But we aren't seeing the painting in a way that's anything close to what Rembrandt's original intention was. Like the anatomy lesson of Dr. Damon that we just saw, it started life in a prestigious location. It got mutilated, but fortunately was also recorded in a drawing by Rembrandt, which I'll bring back in a minute. The location was the new City Hall of Amsterdam, at the center of the city. A massive building, the eighth wonder of the world, the grandest expression of Dutch civic pride and spending power. You can see it here in a slightly later view. Since Napoleonic times, it's been the royal palace. In 1656, city officials began installing large paintings of edifying historical subjects in meeting rooms and halls. They were commissioned from leading artists, in particular, these two former pupils of Rembrandt, Ferdinand Bol, you've already met him, and Govert Flinck. They are huge and colorful in what the British in the next century would call the grand manner. They're bright and legible, with figures who obey the dress code and the rules of classical decorum inherited from Italy and France, and in their own time from Rubens. The picture carried moral instruction for Dutch civic officials. On the left, be brave, like the Roman general Fabricius, when his Greek enemy Pyrrhus tried to frighten him with an elephant. On the right, be humble, don't take bribes. Remember the example of the man in red there. Marcus Curius Dentatus, when the Samnite ambassadors came to offer him a bribe of gold, and he refused and went on with what he was doing, which was cooking turnips. Rembrandt's former pupils got these commissions, not Rembrandt. At this point, he was 50, an old master, acknowledged as a great painter, but a holdout against the newer trends that I've been talking about. And on top of that, he had a reputation as a proud and difficult person. It didn't help that there were years of being overextended financially and of declaring bankruptcy. When the city authorities decided to have 8 huge round-topped pictures illustrating stories from their earliest history, they turned to Flink, who had just started work on the project when he died in 1660. Plan B was to hire a group of other artists, including several more Rembrandt pupils and Rembrandt himself, who accepted the job and the fee for filling in for his former pupil. His assignment was the meeting in the sacred grove and the oath of the Batavians. And Flink had already made this drawing for it. It shows Claudius Civilis at the right in a turban and a few Batavians, all dressed as Roman soldiers, having a decorous handshake. I would think that Rembrandt was given the drawing, probably, and was bored by it. He also saw an earlier image of the scene, I'm sure, this engraving, from Otto van Veen's illustrated history of the Dutch, showing the sacred grove with a lot of handshaking going on by men in 16th century costumes. This was obviously to draw a parallel with the brave ancient Batavians and the Netherlanders of the 16th century who revolted from their Spanish overlord. This oath-taking and rebellion were key acts in the origin story of the Dutch Republic, which was exactly the point of picturing the scene from Tacitus in the city hall. There was no point in showing the Batavians as barbarians. I mean, these were your relatives, after all. A few years ago, art historians made a digital reconstruction of Rembrandt's painting based on the drawing and projected it on the wall where it once was. An interesting demonstration, but the image was pale and fuzzy projected, and it didn't have much of the force of the painting. What's more successful is the digital image they created, the drawing plus shade added, because it suggests the sheer expanse above the table, an empty, shadowy, vaulted space. That's a device of stage design and atmosphere making that only Rembrandt would have used. Well, the huge painting was returned to him. Rembrandt actually, we think, cut out the rectangle that we have today, something like 1/7 of the original canvas, which he then altered by extending the table and adding a figure at the left. He didn't succeed in selling it. 70 years after he died, it was auctioned in Amsterdam to a Swedish buyer. Nobody knows the reason why the picture was returned to him. One reason might be that the size of the figures within the whole area is so much less in relation to the other paintings in the series, which is true, but sounds more like a rationalization than the principal reason. The other reason is decorum. Those barbaric-looking barbarians. Nobody ever seen human figures painted in this way, let alone Batavians, their own ancestors, wearing a grab bag of costumes with their crude features just blocked in with rough, broad strokes. Up close, they're like luminous ghosts. Although, despite their uncouth looks, they do drink from delicate glasses. Rembrandt's Batavians are definitively barbarians, and none more than their commander. He doesn't lead them in handshakes. Their oath is taken on swords, making it clear that there's bloodshed to come. Tacitus says that Claudius Civilis had been disfigured, evidently missing an eye, and Rembrandt shows him full face. His war wound makes him look even more implacable. He wears an outlandish crown and a gold chain. The way Rembrandt presents the hero proclaims that it took a man of raw and scary strength, as well as persuasive arguments, to bind these unruly Batavians into a single rebellious force that could overthrow their Roman masters and secure their freedom. The task of visualizing the scene suited Rembrandt perfectly. His imagination ran to remote times and to acts of patriotic heroism and to themes of national solidarity. That's what this oil sketch is about 20 years earlier, called The Concord of the State. It's an allegory of citizenship that Rembrandt places in the Middle Ages. In time of threat, towns and cities and provinces put aside their differences and mobilize. They act as one. As the Dutch motto goes, in unity is strength. This was part of the message of Rembrandt's group portrait of Amsterdam militiamen. These were mostly businessmen and tradesmen wearing old-fashioned military gear. Men whom Rembrandt imagines acting as latter-day knights in service of their city, led by their officers, marching out through the city gate. Let's just look at the night watch for a moment. It's not so easy to figure out what's going on in all this commotion. The figure is a group portrait, though it may not look like one. 18 of the people in the picture were members of an Amsterdam company of civic guardsmen, volunteer militiamen, and each paid for the privilege of being in the picture, 100 guilders each, about what Rembrandt was getting at the time for a single half-length portrait. Since the late Middle Ages, Amsterdam had had a large city guard. Service was very much part-time and strictly volunteer. From a military standpoint, the civic guard, like the crossbows and handbows they carried, was increasingly obsolete. It was mercenaries who did the fighting now. The citizen militias sometimes served as an honor guard. The function was mainly symbolic and social. In the War of Independence from Spain, a generation earlier, though, citizen soldiers had helped defend some cities, and the memory of those moments of courage and glory was kept alive by the guards in meetings and practice sessions and banquets. Group portraits were a regular thing after new officers were chosen. At first, these pictures were pretty stiff, but in time, and some artists introduced some more variety and even suggestions of forward movement. At the bottom is a painting by Thomas de Keyser, a competitor of Rembrandt's for a while, which shows a raised platform with stairs that the principal officers had climbed or were climbing, and gives a sense of movement forward. Rembrandt respects the traditional formula, but he goes much farther and deeper. In the center is a captain, Frans Banning-Kok, holding the baton in his right hand, the baton of command, and wearing a red sash, the red of the Amsterdam coat of arms, not over a uniform, but over a handsome black suit of well-to-do patricians. His second in command, Lieutenant Willem van Ruitenburg, is in military outfit, and a fancy one, of perfectly tailored yellow leather, and carries a kind of obsolete spear decorated with a tassel of blue and gold. The colors of the militia company, the clovineers, the musketeers. He turns deferentially to his captain, who's giving the order to march out, and emphasizing it with his hand gesture, whose shadow, you see, falls on the lieutenant's jacket. Third in rank is the ensign, or the standard bearer, Jan Cornelis Visser, who holds the flag on high and looks up at it proudly. Visser was a wealthy bachelor. Ensigns were traditionally unmarried men because in battle they carried the flag at the head of the company, and their death rate had been very high. There were 13 others who paid to have their portraits included, most of them cloth merchants, all members of the mercantile upper middle class. The amazing and novel thing here is that there are 16 extras on stage. A dozen or so are just heads in the background, but some of them are conspicuous, and they add excitement, and for us, some mystery to the painting. Some of them are in action. Two guardsmen here with blue arrows are tending to their muskets, performing steps prescribed in the manual of arms. The man at the left is charging his musket with powder, and the one on the right is blowing on the pan to remove excess powder. And right in the middle, just behind Banningcock, and behind the lieutenant, is a young man wearing a 16th century outfit, actually firing a musket, something that wasn't allowed at events like this. He doesn't belong to the militia at all. He's there to personify the company's namesake, the clover, the musket. There's another purely symbolic figure, the girl in the dazzling silk dress. She has a dead chicken hanging from her belt, whose claws resemble the heraldic symbol of the militia company. But in the words of the late Egbert Haverkamp Begeman, she belongs to a different reality. This is poetic license Rembrandt is using. The freedom to portray the guardsmen in dramatic guises, as though we were witnessing an actual event, and the freedom to include symbolic personages imported from an earlier era when Amsterdam militias were in their glory. Again, he's infusing the present with the past. Rembrandt painted the picture for the militia headquarters, the Cloveniersdune, which was built in the 1630s and later destroyed. You can see it in the lower right next to an 18th century image of the hall. And at the top is a reconstruction. In Rembrandt's time, the Night Watch was hung with 5 others by leading painters of around the same time, and you can see it there on the left side of the back wall. Many of these are shown together today at the Rijksmuseum. In 1715, the Night Watch was moved to City Hall and hung between 2 doors. And since there wasn't enough space between the doors for the pictures to fit, it was simply cut down on all sides. Luckily, this copy on the right records its original condition. And the lines we've put on the copy show the original edges of the picture. So you can see they removed a strip at the left, a couple of feet wide, eliminating 3 figures, as well as a lot of the empty space that the officers were moving toward, which reducing the effect of Rembrandt's bold off-center placement. So once again, Rembrandt takes up the staid formula of a group portrait and transforms it. He introduces vigorous forward motion, complex overlappings, rich, suggestive costumes and props and stage business, and adds dramatic light. All this heightens our sense that what's happening here is of high importance. 30 years later, Samuel van Hoogstraten, one of Rembrandt's many pupils, wrote this: The picture will outlast all its competitors, in my opinion, being so painterly in thought, so dashing in arrangement, and so powerful that in the opinion of some, all the other pieces in the hall stand beside it like playing cards. Still, I would have preferred him to put more light into it. I want to bring back the painted copy for a second and look again at the strip at the left, which you remember was cut away in 1715 and discarded. In the strip, there were two more musketeers and a boy. The man in back there, wearing black, has his hat on. The other man has taken his hat off to display his full head of long, curly blonde hair. He's exceptionally well dressed in a fine light brown jacket with many buttons, a lace collar, and he holds a bandolier and a musket. Recently, he was identified as a 28-year-old cloth merchant named Jan Berkman, who was very rich and who was a figure in Amsterdam society. It was observed a long time ago that he resembles the subject of one of the most dazzling portraits of the period, this one in the Hammer Museum. Dazzling because of what he wears, a jacket of richly woven shot silk, as flamboyantly different from both the black clothing worn by the upper classes as it is from military garb. In fact, it's unique in Dutch portraiture. When we sent this image out on the right had some ragged edges that needed to be masked, what we got back was this. And I felt you needed to see it. This man even wears a hospital mask elegantly. This may well be Jan Berkman, a socialite who holds a pose that we very seldom see in portraiture, turned 90 degrees and holding his hat, all the better to upstage himself with his knockout clothing, which Rembrandt painted with breathtaking dazzle. The head is both solid and sensitive, but it's hard not to be distracted by that silk and lace. If this is Jan Berkman, he's been treated badly twice, first by failing to make the cut in the Night Watch, and then by having this portrait trimmed down at some time in its history. We know that from looking at the back, that it's been cut on all four sides, and that the wood is painted on is not the usual oak, but poplar. We know that Rembrandt bought a supply of 8 or 10 poplar panels, all the same size, and used them at this period. Now here is one of them, a terrible photograph, but a portrait just to show you the proportions of the picture. The original extent of the hammer painting, you can see by the outer white lines, and the inner ones show it as it is now. Whoever the hammer man was, and I'm betting on Jan Berkman, he originally had more breathing room, as you see. Let me take out time out for just a second and tell you that there's a question and answer period right after I end this talk. So if you've got questions, please send them using the chat feature on your screen. Speaking of militiamen, I want to return to the theme of service and show a few more paintings by Rembrandt that embody it. The first is a portrait of a 50-year-old man with a sympathetic face and a glorious gilded sash. He holds a staff with the flag of a militia company. He's an ensign, or standard bearer of the company, which comes as a surprise since ensigns, as you heard a moment ago, were almost always much younger than this and usually pictured as swashbuckling types. 20 years earlier, Rembrandt had portrayed another one, this man in a stagey pose that's typical of ensigns, who flaunted themselves as though no harm could possibly come to them. He has features somewhat like Rembrandt's, and he wears an old-fashioned, extravagantly old-fashioned officer outfit. This may not even be a commissioned portrait at all, but it might be what the Dutch called a tronie, a single figure in fancy dress painted for sale. In any case, he's a kind of emblem of proud and almost belligerent defiance. And this attitude wasn't Rembrandt's invention. Ensigns were beloved subjects for printmakers who pictured soldiers in all their macho ostentation. And this is a commissioned portrait of an ensign by Thomas de Keyser, who was a leading portrait painter in Amsterdam before Rembrandt arrived. The man is gorgeously dressed, and he acts his part in a kind of stage setting that the artist has invented for him. This man may have served as an ensign for many years. When I worked at the Metropolitan, the label simply read, "The Standard Bearer," since we had no idea who he was. Then the Amsterdam archivist searched the records of militia companies for ensigns in their 50s, who were a rarity, and they found a certain Floris Schoop, well-known owner of a glass and mirror making firm, who was the oldest ensign in the Civic Guard in 1654, the year the picture is dated. Well, whatever personal pride may have caused Floris Schoop to order the portrait, there's no bravado in it. Instead, a kind of tremendous dignity. The man chose to be defined and remembered as a citizen doing his duty. Living in Floris Schoop's neighborhood was a man Rembrandt knew well, who commissioned a portrait that has nothing to do with chivalric ideals or patriotism, but is one of Rembrandt's greatest works. For me, the most beautiful and best preserved of all his portraits. Jan Six was a poet and a playwright and a member of a patrician family and future burgomaster of Amsterdam. Just what it is that he's wearing, especially the red garment over his shoulder, has come in for a lot of speculation. We've learned recently from the costume specialist Marieke de Winkel that Jan Six is wearing riding clothes. His long gray riding coat with many buttons was called a kazak, and the scarlet cloak he's slung over it had just recently come into fashion, and it wasn't seen in many portraits. Six chose to be portrayed here as a country gentleman, in other words, rather than as a city sophisticate or intellectual, which is the guise that Rembrandt had already used 7 years earlier in an etching of Six, reading at a window in a room full of literary and artistic and aristocratic props. In the painting, Six is pulling on his gloves as if he were leaving. There's something intimate in that gesture and his momentary look at us. The wonder of the portrait as a painting is in those hands. Six was a connoisseur of art, and it's tempting to think that Rembrandt's show of virtuosity with the brush here in the costume and the hands and the gloves was intended to appeal to this very sophisticated client, a virtuoso himself, who could appreciate the amazing freedom here. This is Rembrandt demonstrating the power of suggestion. That's the hallmark of his last dozen years. Well, back for a moment to the theme of the oath of the Batavians to courage and patriotism in the defense of one's people. In the mid-1650s, Rembrandt painted this famous enigma, showing a young horseman armed to the teeth. His weapons and clothes identify him as Polish, so it was assumed for a long time that this was a commissioned portrait of a particular Polish man, but there's no evidence for that, and it doesn't conform to the traditions of equestrian portraiture. Various allegorical readings have been proposed, and of those, the most persuasive and durable was published in a famous article by my teacher, Julius Held. Held argued that the young man was an imaginary Polish soldier who Rembrandt meant to be seen as a latter-day Christian knight. At this period, there were actual Polish light cavalrymen, like this one, out defending the eastern borders of Europe against the Ottoman Turks. Held pointed out that Rembrandt probably got his horse from the well-known engraving by Dürer, which I'll show you in reverse to make things easier. Dürer provided not only the model for Rembrandt's horse, but also the idea of the painting. That is, that there might be a modern equivalent of the ideal Christian knight described by Erasmus, the miles Christianus, moving fearlessly through a shadowy landscape of unseen dangers. The picture might well have been commissioned rather than painted on spec. It's got some weak spots, the top of the boots, the blanket, the horse's tail, all look to have painted by a weaker hand, somebody in the studio. And for a while, some specialists even had doubts about the attribution to Rembrandt. But the best parts are so fine and typical, and the conception of the picture is so original and noble that those doubts have pretty much disappeared. I've been paying a lot of attention to Rembrandt's historical imagination, his power to picture situations from the remote past that get to the heart of whatever subject he treated. This was still one of Rembrandt's selling points in the contest for clients. It may or may not have helped secure a commission from a Sicilian nobleman who doesn't seem to have cared much about subject matter at all, but was definitely attracted to celebrity artists. His name was Don Antonio Ruffo, and he lived in Messina in a palace that he was busy filling with pictures. Through a middleman, he ordered a painting from Rembrandt of a philosopher. Which philosopher wasn't specified. The choice of Aristotle was evidently Rembrandt's rather than Ruffo's. Rembrandt's Aristotle is one of his greatest acts of historical imagination. Neither he nor anybody else knew what Aristotle had actually looked like, or Homer for that matter, whose portrait bust you see. In Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great, Aristotle was the tutor of Alexander the Great, and Alexander, in turn, thought so highly of Aristotle that he carried a copy of the Iliad in a special casket. All three men are present in this picture, and they're connected. Aristotle is in a medallion in profile at the very far left, hanging from the heavy gold chain that Aristotle fingers with his left hand. He rests his other hand on Homer's head. Wisdom from Homer has passed through the teacher to the pupil Alexander. That transmission is the theme of Dr. Tulp and his pupil and the anatomy book, and also of the preacher Onslow with his troubled wife and the Bible. The teacher as intermediary for essential knowledge. And there's something else in play here. Julius Held wrote an important article about this picture too. The painting's traditional title had been Aristotle Contemplating the Bust of Homer. Held explained that Aristotle isn't contemplating the bust. He's not even looking at it. He's looking past it. He's lost in thought. His thoughts, Held suggested, dwelt on the freedom represented by Homer, a pure poet with no worldly entanglements or rewards. Aristotle's own life was full of entanglements and rewards, serving kings, being favored with a gold chain that he wears. What he was contemplating, Held said, was his situation, captive to worldly affairs, the gold chain, and remembering with envy the freedom of the life of the mind. He touches Homer's statue. The picture shows an eminent man pondering the price he's paid for success. The action here is purely mental and emotional. We read that in his hands and in his weary face, in his shadowed eyes, and in the atmosphere of the room, which Rembrandt creates with the play of light. The light, of course, is entirely an illusion. There's no light to just paint. It gives the marble bust a nearly flesh color and something like an inner light. It makes the gold chain glitter seductively. It gives the pleated gown a palpable texture and a believable luminosity. The paint models everything so subtly that the light it creates seems to embody the complexities of Aristotle's thought and his situation. My friend and successor at the Met, the later Walter Liedtke, went further. He wrote this: Rembrandt represents the figure not as a sage from whom wisdom emanates, but as a man who contemplates ethical problems and puzzles them out for himself. What Don Antonio thought about the picture we don't know, but he ordered 2 companion pieces from Rembrandt, pictures of Homer and Alexander the Great. The Alexander has never been identified, although this picture in Glasgow has been claimed to be it. When Ruffo received his Alexander, he complained about it in a petulant letter to the Dutch consul in Messina, telling him to report back to Rembrandt, and I quote now, just how little pleased he who commissioned the Alexander is with his painting, which cost him more than the Aristotle, and that the Alexander was painted on 4 pieces of canvas sewn together. These 4 seams are horrible beyond words. Well, this painting probably resembles the one Rousseau fusses over, but it wasn't enlarged from ahead, as he claimed also, and it doesn't match up in size or seams. What has survived, though, after many misfortunes, is the Homer. The painting shows the blind Homer dictating. As it's come down to us, it has some of the glowing richness and deep seriousness of the Aristotle, although it's been through a fire, literally, and been cut down. Imagining what it might once have looked like has been a quest for specialists for years. The evidence for imagining the original appearance is, first of all, an inventory stating that Homer pictured it with two pupils. And then there's this drawing by Rembrandt that is clearly connected to the Homer we have, but whose proportions are different from the Aristotle's. Then there's this picture by Art de Gelder, who was Rembrandt's pupil in the 1660s, and who made a number of paintings later on that reflect compositions by Rembrandt that were in the studio when he worked there. Taking all this evidence, plus a bit of a writing pad that you can just make out in the lower right corner, Ernst van de Wetering made a sketch to suggest the original extent of Ruffo's painting, which he believes must have been vertical, not horizontal like de Gelder's. Now, that's perfectly plausible, but it still leaves a lot to the imagination. The subject, Homer dictating his verses, was extremely rare in art. Rembrandt seems to have relied on a fanciful biography of Homer that in his time was attributed to Herodotus, which says that after many adventures, Homer sailed to the island of Chios, became a tutor, and dictated his epics to his pupils. Even now, after such serious mutilation, the figure of Homer glows with a soft, mystical light. For Rembrandt, Homer embodies the paradox that although eyesight is important, and for whom could it be more important than a painter or a collector, The mind's eye sees more. It's not the literal vision, but the imaginative vision that brings immortality to the poet and to the painter. I'm going to end this talk about commissions in Rembrandt's last years with some clear proof that he had admirers in high places. Here's another life-size picture from classical antiquity, a figure that evidently belonged to a rich moneylender, Hermann Becker, who collected Rembrandt's work and lent him money. Let's just look at it again and a few details, and then I'll come back to you. She wears a crown and holds a scepter and has a peacock by her side at the lower left. That was enough for Rembrandt's audience to identify her as Juno, queen of the gods, spouse of the philandering Zeus. The pose is strictly frontal, regal, like her costume of heavily embroidered silk and ermine and heavy jewelry. There's no action. She's presented like a cult figure, which she was in a way, as we'll see. Rembrandt gave one other person this kind of commanding frontal pose, himself. He also wears rich, vaguely Eastern clothing, and his cane resembles a scepter. He shows himself as a formidable personage, but his shadowy face has nothing of the candor of his Juno. The inspiration for her pose may go back to several pictures that Titian painted more than a century earlier. Rembrandt admired Titian both for his brushwork and for his widespread fame, as we've seen earlier. The robust physiques and frank praising expressions have a good deal in common. Why Rembrandt would have painted Juno remained a puzzle for a long time. Its meaning has become clearer in recent years. 50 years ago, Julius Held showed what a picture of Juno might have signified for his audience, using prints as evidence. There's no surprise here. We've been seeing how often Rembrandt turned to his large collection of prints for information and inspiration. These show that Juno, the goddess, served a purpose in the 17th century, maybe especially in mercantile Holland, and that was to personify wealth and the amassing of wealth and the honor that wealth conferred on those who had it. At the top, Juno shows up to reward an elderly scholar with an armload of gold and silver. Below at the left, she floats seductively above the earth, framed by vignettes of coins and expensive metalwork. At the right, closer to Rembrandt's own time, Juno's on the throne as the patroness of wealth and its creation. Now here it's actually created from raw materials that are being brought into the splendid public building in the background. It seems likely that the picture was commissioned by Hermann Becker, the wealthy financier who owned it. And what better patron saint could Becker have chosen than Juno? Her presence in his house, painted by a great master, would have been a flattering reminder of his achievements. But if we consider what else Becker had in his house, the possibilities are even richer. His inventory included a Pallas, that is Pallas Athena or Minerva, by Rembrandt, and a Venus and Cupid, also by Rembrandt, a threesome of goddesses. And that's the same trio that was painted by the influential German painter Adam Elsheimer and engraved. Becker's trio probably consisted of these three pictures by Rembrandt, which have been separated for a long time. And their condition varies a lot, as you can see. The two at the ends were originally larger, but were cut down. Juno, posed frontally, must have been in the middle. I don't think it changes her significance. I think she represented wealth, flanked by love and wisdom. It's very possible that Becker saw those three goddesses embodying virtues that he already possessed, but it's also possible that they represented for him hopes, wishes, aspirations. In any event, the commanding figure is Juno, bedecked with treasure, painted with sumptuous colors and textures. Rembrandt gave only one other female this kind of grandeur and authority, and that was a portrait sitter, the elderly Margarethe de Geer. She and her husband, Jacob Tripp, were two of the most powerful people in Amsterdam. Jacob Tripp was about 85, and his wife Margarethe was somewhat younger. Tripp died in 1661, so it's possible that Rembrandt painted his portrait posthumously. Tripp was a partner in a vast business involving mining and metallurgy, gun manufacture, arms dealing, and foreign trade. His wife was from another wealthy commercial family, the De Geers, that had partnerships with the Tripps. Their marriage was reinforced in subsequent generation by more intermarriage. Margarethe sits in a chair that's turned a bit towards her husband, following convention, but she faces us, the viewers, frontally. It's unnerving. This is a pose that you've seen has associations with royalty, even divinity. And I think it suggests other qualities too, more secular and moral, candor, openness, qualities that ever since antiquity were attributed particularly to old age. The pictures hang together in the National Gallery in London, and nearby there's a second portrait of Margarethe, painted around the same time. And it's a jolt. In this one, the raking light reveals her loose flesh and her toothlessness. There's a debate over whether this was a study for the larger portrait or an independent work of art in a more convenient size. I'm inclined to think it was a sketch or a trial intended for the large picture, and that he got her features right, but he had a different idea, possibly suggested by the woman herself, to change the pose and lighting, to transform the image of frailty into one of strength and vision. In the detail at the right, seen head on, her collapsed mouth isn't her main feature. The modeling and relief of her face is less emphatic, and it casts gentler shadows. Her cap is wider, and there's more hair in front of it, making a symmetrical form that conveys something like majesty. That big ruff she wears was already old-fashioned 20 years before this, but many older women stuck to it, making a virtue out of ignoring fashion. Looking at the meticulous way he painted the folded edge of the ruff, it might feel strange to see Rembrandt using such an exact, you could say, old-fashioned way of painting, but Rembrandt respected the convention of doing that. Like the gloves she holds, the ruff was also an advertisement of wealth. The gloves were made of lace and extremely expensive, and she has a fur-lined overgarment. Her husband wears something similar, a tabard, medieval survival that we've seen worn by other older men who present themselves as learned or otherwise eminent. He has a silver cane. At 85, he may have used that stick to support himself, but it's also a sign of patriarchal majesty too. It is ceremonial, like the one Rembrandt himself holds like a scepter in the Frick self-portrait of just a few years earlier. Having these on the screen together shows how Rembrandt used another compositional device. His own figure fills the frame. The trips are smaller by comparison. Rembrandt's head is not quite frontal. Hers is. The differences in color and tonality have a lot to do with the relatively worn condition of the trip portraits and the surprising yellow Rembrandt gave himself, plus the variables of photo studio lighting. Jakob Tripp wears informal indoor clothing, a big robe that's part tabard and part padded Japanese kimono, both favored by people who could afford them, and a nightcap of the type that we see in many domestic portraits. This is a man who's no longer in the world, and you might say not long for this world. Rembrandt himself was nearing 60, an age when you were thought to be old. Rembrandt and Tripp was 85 and very, very old, the age of Rembrandt's long dead parents, conventionally an age for men of wisdom, and for women, perseverance and devotion to family. Jakob's head is a miracle. It is firmly, solidly structured, but with a soft, broken surface, a welter of touches that convey the man's patchy, dry skin and wispy hair. Everyone who looked at Tripp's portrait must have known that in the last years of his life, he was a great eminence. He and his wife had 7 children, of whom 2 brothers were earning a fortune in business in the Netherlands and especially abroad in the Baltic. This is a very large painting on the left by Allard van Everdingen that shows the Tripp foundry in Sweden, where the cannons were made and exported to anybody who paid for them. They were international arms dealers. At the time Rembrandt was painting their parents, the brothers Louis and Hendrik were building the grandest house at the city. Actually, 2 separate houses behind this double-wide facade in Amsterdam, adorned with relief sculptures of arms and armor. It's likely that this new house was the occasion for commissioning Rembrandt's portraits. By this time, a lot of artists had painted the Tripps. The others worked in the mid-century style, following the new conventions of lighter and brighter and more elegant portraiture. Several had been pupils of Rembrandt, like Nicholas Maas, who painted this one about the same time as Rembrandt's portrait. The comparison helps us to see both of them better. Maas makes Tripp more accessible, cosseted, honored by all that red velvet. Rembrandt's Tripp is more complex and certainly more severe. That's a fair description of both these portraits. These people are shown in their social roles as faithful man and wife. They have been rewarded for their virtue with remarkable old age, and they've accumulated not just material wealth, but also wealth of experience. All this is conventional. What's not conventional is Rembrandt's suggestion that both of them have been to depths we can't reach or fathom in their lives, that their real wealth may be in their awareness of the world. In the last talk in the series, I'm going to turn to other well-known late pictures, like this one, and explore Rembrandt's final history paintings. We'll see how they convey the essence of some powerful stories that inspired him to push his visionary technique to the limit. In the meantime, please take care of yourselves and try to join me.
Well, bravo again. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. I don't even know where to start. There were so many different questions that I came up that I was thinking of during that program. But first, maybe you could just tell us again about how these paintings are living in Southern California and where can we find them?
Sure. Well, they're all over the place, really. Depends on whether you come from east to west or west to east. Let's start east. Let's start at the Norton Simon Museum, where you saw already at least one picture. Norton Simon bought their bunch of them at the Getty, most recent immigrants to Southern California, at the Getty Museum. And there are two at the Hammer, and a bunch at the County Museum, particularly early pictures. Anyway, the net of it is that there are maybe 14 or 15 paintings and a dozen or so drawings and a huge number of etchings, all in Southern California museums. And actually, you don't have to despair of this because there's a website. There is RembrandtSocal.org, RembrandtInSocal.org, and I think it's on your website, the Hammer website. Go to that and you will see everything with links to other documentation and the like.
Thank you. Do you want to tell us how that website originated? Because I think we had an error last week.
Well, yeah, I forgot, strangely enough, that the project started back when the Getty did an exhibition of late Rembrandt so-called portraits, religious portraits. It was started by Scott Schaefer, who turned the project to Ann Woollett, who's still there, is very much there as the specialist in Northern painting. And she turned to her colleagues at the Hammer, at the Simon, particularly Cindy Burlingham, who played a role in it too. So it's a joint project of all those specialists, and it's a terrific website.
Great. Well, thank you. We have some questions pouring in. Here's another one that references our website. Oops, now I've lost the question. It's a question from MM. What book would you recommend as a great or definitive work on Rembrandt?
Oh, it's right there on the website. It depends on how much money you've got. There's a reference to the newest, biggest catalog of paintings, and also its companion volume on the etchings, both published by Taschen, both a bundle of money, but probably worth it if you have the money. Otherwise, read the books by Gary Schwartz, which are beautifully illustrated as well as very enjoyable to read. If you're interested in a little more distance and a little more adventuresome writing, read the book by Simon Schama called Rembrandt's Eyes. When you're all done that, let me know and I'll give you some more, because something comes out every year at least.
And just a reminder to the audience, we've pasted a bibliography of books that John Walsh is recommending for further Rembrandt reading. It's available on the Hammer website and the pages associated with this series. Okay, another question from Pamela Andrada. Hello, I've never understood the use of X-rays in paintings. Could you explain how the X-ray can see from layer to layer?
Yes, I'll try to make it understandable. X-rays are stopped by dense material. The denser it is, the less the ray comes through. You know that because your bones show up in your own X-rays. And in paintings, the densest things are that you see most extensively are made of lead white mixed with lead anyway, which is common to use all over the place and was in the 17th century. Other pigments block X-rays variably, some hardly at all, and some more or less. But in any case, what an X-ray gives you on the film anyway is the negative of the rays that passed through, and which means the positive of the rays that were blocked, which is effectively a drawing in white of where the whites are in the painting. Now, that sounds all very straightforward and you should be able to make it out easily. The trouble is that artists rework, and move their whites around and altogether make an image on the X-ray that can be very confusing. You saw an example of that in the case of the X-ray of the Syndics of the Drapers Guild, where a number of different figures showed up, only one of which is actually in the finished picture. So anyway, you have a sort of shadow graph of the light that comes through the picture. I should say light, but the X-rays that come through the picture, and a kind of white mass where the lead white is, and that's in a short way the way X-rays work. Same as your physician.
Thank you. Now we have another technical question from Cindy Stone. She asks, in the painting of Jan Six and others, the face has very blended brushstrokes, whereas the brushstrokes on the costume are more abstract. Is this deliberate, or is it from vision problems, or is it different painters, or what do you think is the reason for that?
It's totally deliberate, and you find it in artists going back into Titian, for example, and artists give themselves the liberty of painting more loosely in the less important areas. The not face, that is the hands often, and the costume, and enjoy a certain sort of virtuosic ability to suggest rather than spell out what you're looking at. And that's almost to be expected of artists' work at many eras. There are other times when artists expect themselves, or their clients did, to finish everything to more or less the same degree of fineness. Rembrandt was following a tradition by making costumes more fluent and suggestive, and the face parts that counted the most make them more clear. Rembrandt did something that is really remarkable, which is to produce a kind of richness of effect in the faces, and that gets stronger all the time as the paintings, he goes further into the 50s and 60s. And the next lecture, I'm going to talk more about that, and I'll show you some details to see how the trick is pulled off between suggestive drapery and rich and complex facial features.
Okay, well, maybe Astrid might not want to wait until next week, because she is asking which of the books that you recommended could tell her more about Rembrandt's techniques, how he painted textiles, skins, and what types of brushes, canvases, etc. So she's looking for more technical painting information.
Yes. Get the catalog published by the National Gallery in London on Rembrandt painting, Rembrandt at work. I forget the name of the title, but it's easy to find this. And there are copies for sale. It's not in print anymore, but there are copies for sale in the used book trade and online. If I can, in the meantime, between now and next week, I'm sure I can dig up that title and either put it on the website at the Hammer or tell you. So come back, please.
All right, now I'm going to use moderator's privilege and ask a question of my own. You mentioned that styles were changing over time, and as Rembrandt got older, his pupils started getting more of the business than he was getting, and trends were changing. Why, after 1650, did he not brighten up his paintings in the same manner as his pupils, especially if that's what the patrons wanted and they were giving all the business to his students?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We don't really have a definitive answer. And what's interesting about the fact that we don't have a definitive answer is that these ideas about what made Rembrandt so determined to continue and get perhaps even deeper and darker with age, rather than go with fashion and go where the money was. It's funny, in the 19th century, it was kind of assumed that Rembrandt was the model kind of national hero in his truth-telling and his consistency Whereas in the 20th century, dark became partly associated, at least, with profundity and with insight, with truth, and this with resistance to change became a positive virtue, a kind of sign of intellectual and moral strength. In the 21st century, we're a little more skeptical of these projections of the values of the time onto Rembrandt and Rembrandt's life. Rembrandt was not an easy person. He was, what the little we know about his personality reflects a kind of pride, kind of difficulty, a lot of legal, small stuff, legal lawsuits and the like. We think it might be now that it may be just more simple, a kind of pride and a kind of truculent, assertion that he'd been right all along, and that he could go his own way, and he'd still have a clientele, maybe smaller, but they would understand him, and they'd be faithful to him, and they would hire him, and he would do their portraits. That I'm putting that point of view forward sympathetically because, of course, it's mine. I mean, and I fully expect that in 50 years' time or 20 years' time, somebody's going to have a brighter idea of why Rembrandt kept on going when he stayed straight while everybody else turned to the right towards the lighter, looser, blonder, and more accommodating kind of flattering figure style.
Well, it sounds like, if you are right in this theory, that he was in fact proven right, because his genius prevails. So
yeah. But it is also, you can learn from what we now think of as mistakes so much. I mean, the 19th century made Rembrandt a hero partly because they needed a national hero. They wanted to be different from their neighbors and former enemies to the south, the now Belgians, but the Flemish. They were sensitive, that is 19th century Dutch people, sensitive to what happened at the end of the 17th century in Holland, which is that French fashion came in a big way in clothes and in painting style. And Rembrandt's the one who didn't go that way. Rembrandt stood for what they considered their virtues.
Well, I love them. So I'm glad he stuck with his druthers. Now, John asks in the audience, was the three-part concept in the Juno and Aristotle series mainly the idea of the patrons, or did Rembrandt also admire that idea? Did he do any other three-part series?
Excellent idea. The answer is no, not that well, that's not quite true. Let me think for a second about that. Yeah, I showed, I think in the very first lecture, a three-part composition, you could say, of small paintings on copper. One showing a rough and tumble warrior head laughing, then in the middle, a self-portrait, and then on the right-hand side, an old woman. And we think this was intended as a kind of demonstration of three different ways of painting. The trio also of, which is something, the trio of Aristotle and Homer, after all, and Alexander the Great, it's another, because they were bought by the same client, sounds like it was intended as a threesome. And the Juno, the question of whether the Juno and the Venus and Cupid trio, whether that with the Juno trio was Rembrandt's idea or whether it was his rich clients is completely, we have no idea. And that's true of a great deal of Rembrandt's subject matter. But it would be perfectly easy to imagine that somebody who was rich but not all that well educated, certainly not to the level of Rembrandt in terms of classical mythology, would come to him wanting his portrait painted, wanting something from him wanting a picture that might honor him in some fashion. That's possible. And that one thing led to another, and Rembrandt managed to sell him on the idea not just of a Juno, but two other classical figures that are demonstrably, through the prints that I showed, linked to a kind of triple virtue for a man of his standing. The central virtue being wealth, the ability to make it and the ability to spend it well.
Understood. So KP asks, what do the descendants of his group portraits think of these pictures of their ancestors?
Well, the only one I think that we know anything about is the Six family. You saw Jan Six's portrait. Jan Six is not in any of the group portraits, but he had his portrait done a couple of times by Rembrandt, as you saw on the screen just now. And Jan Six's portrait, the one I showed, the painted portrait, has come down in the family, and not just in the family, but to each member of the succeeding generation whose name was Jan Six. So the picture now is in the hands of the so-called Jonkheer Jan Six, a man who's like my age or so, and his son, also called Jan Six. I think he's Jan Six the 9th or something like that, or the 11th. Jan Six is an art dealer, a very knowledgeable man. He owns one of the pictures that I showed in the first lecture, his dad doesn't care so much. His dad is very knowledgeable, but is not, I think, a passionate lover of art. Whereas Jan Six, or Janni, as he's called by some, is definitely very keen and has made a number of quite fine discoveries of work by Rembrandt as well as other artists. So, so that's a long-winded answer to the question. I don't think we know anybody for sure that is descended from the people who sat for those group portraits, but the Jan Six family continues to be eminent, and the picture is still in their house, the miracle of Jan Six. And the portrait is that it's hanging on a wall near a window, 12 feet away, with wonderful side light, the same light coming in off the Amstel River that it had when it first was delivered to the patron. And it's in marvelous condition. And you can have an experience there. By the way, you can do this by making an online reservation with the Six family. It's called the Six Collection, and it's searchable very quickly. You can find, maybe until 2025 that you get to see it, but it'll be there, that you know for sure. You can see a picture under conditions that I can't think of another painting anywhere that can be seen under those conditions. It's perfect. So
that's incredible. I can't believe I missed that when I was in Amsterdam. Wow, that's amazing. So related to subjects of paintings, Jan asks, who was the model for the woman in the Night Watch?
Oh, the woman being the little girl with the white silk dress, I imagine. We don't know. Because we don't know who Rembrandt's models were generally, unless they were people who paid for their part in the picture. And those were all men who paid their 100 guilders. And then, as I said, Rembrandt threw in a whole bunch of extras of all kinds, some of them allegorical like her, or the guy shooting the musket off right behind the captain. We don't know who the girl was.
I think we had this question last week, perhaps, but I'm not certain, so I'm going to ask it again. Paula asks, was Van Gogh influenced by Rembrandt? She's thinking of the evocative, rough brushwork used in the faces. Rembrandt's colleagues seem to be doing something more finished, but less adventurous.
I think that's very true. Rembrandt's colleagues, pupils, and others were doing something more polished and more acceptable to the people of their time. Did Rembrandt know the brushwork of Rembrandt? Well, yeah, he studied it face to face in the then new Rijksmuseum and elsewhere where he could see pictures by the artist. he made a self-portrait of himself standing at an easel, which is based on the pose in a Rembrandt portrait that he knew either from illustrations or in the original. And as to the brushwork, sure. Now, he studied Frans Hals and loved that loose, free, fluid way of painting, but he, I think, understood very well what you could get by building up a paint surface. And I think possibly, though he doesn't talk about it, leaving some of the brush marks visible. He attributed that idea to Frans Hals, not so much to Rembrandt. But just the intensity and the sort of magnificently rich finish of flesh painted by Rembrandt surely stuck with him all his life, I think.
Beth Sanders says, I was surprised that the carpet on the table with the fabric merchants seemed roughly painted, or has the painting degraded?
It's roughly painted, and it may have lost something, but not much. It's suggestive in the way that lots of other painted fabrics are in Rembrandt. And Rembrandt didn't take it on himself to paint every thread or every patch just so. He wanted to give a suggestion of it. And if you think about where that picture would have been originally seen, where it was painted to be seen, think of the composition. I mentioned at the beginning of my description of the picture that there's a wainscot behind him, a paneling goes way up high, maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 feet up above the floor. It's there that the painting probably hung. So you didn't get a good view of it. You only saw the edge of that table, and suggestion was going to be fine. In fact, it might have been much more alive, like the real thing, by being loosely painted and suggestive rather than being exact.
Thank you. And here comes a very interesting question. KP asks, is there any art theory or aesthetic theory of the time that related visual composition to music?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think either. I can't think of any descriptions of contemporary music in Rembrandt's time or of art that relates in any way that we could understand. And whether, but that is a good question, and it makes me want to think if I'm giving a useful answer or not. There may yet be some theory of temperaments that got through to Rembrandt through his classical reading, but I don't think it applies to music theory.
Well, KP, that sounds like you have a thesis topic if you ever want to do a PhD.
Yeah. KP, you're going to send me back to the Rembrandt's literature to see what anybody's written about it. Thank you.
Okay. A says that John Walsh mentioned that Rembrandt's late rough style, what John Walsh described as virtuosic, was not the favored style during that period. When did this style come to be seen and appreciated as virtuosic? Was there a particular critic, collector, or art historian that rehabilitated Rembrandt in this way?
I think he was always admired, and he was praised during particularly the latter half of the 18th century. The late 17th and early 18th century, his broad style, I think, was perhaps appreciated as an interesting anomaly, but it was attacked by art writers after the middle of the 17th century, and was always there as a kind of eccentricity in the writing about art. It wasn't, I think, until the beginning of the Romantic period, the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, that people began to understand again that this looser, rougher manner had something that a slicker style could not possibly rival in the way of authenticity. And it's not so much virtuosity, but authenticity and strength and life.
That is reminding me of a question I had earlier about the night watch. Maybe we should bring up that slide. I'm not sure what the slide number is, but
Um, Second here, that's easy. Bring up number 50, 50,
so
please.
my, which it just that everything about this painting really blew my mind, especially when I understood, thanks to you, what it's really about and what this image is for. Um, but where, I studied lighting. Where does the lighting come from? Where's the light source supposed to be in this painting? Because I don't see any lanterns or light sources painted.
Good, yeah. And there are not many shadows either. The one that the eye falls on first is the shadow of the leg or two legs of the captain of their Banning Cock, and also his lieutenant, right? And that would put the source of light kind of over the viewer's shoulder and out of the picture. And then light falls on the girl in the white, and then very spottily in other places. There's a strong shadow from Banning Cock's hand that falls on his lieutenant's coat, which I mentioned, and you can see. The thing is, what's always misleading to people is the title. The title was given the picture sometime in the 18th century when the picture was already darkened and it began to look like a night scene. It never was a light scene. It's a daylight scene.
What?
Yeah, what is right, but it's darkened. We've talked a little before in previous lectures about this darkening effect. What happens to oil paint layers is that they become more translucent with time. Under them lies a layer of brownish red ground. And as the paint layers above get a bit less, it's not thinner so much, but they lose their hiding power diminishes some. The brownish reddish tint from below begins to come forward and darken the picture, except for the very light parts. So there's an increased contrast and a loss of all kinds of subtle light effects that we can no longer see. This is the effect of that darkening, which you see in lots and lots and lots of Rembrandts and other 17th century paintings, Italian paintings too. The effect of that is to sort of, it can't be remediated. There's nothing you can do to fix it. The other thing that has darkened this picture over the years has been the application of varnish, clear varnish that and heightens the effect of the paint when it's originally put on, but it's also got the property of turning brown, or yellow first and then brown. And there are paintings in important museums that still have brown varnish on them. We looked at them before in this series, in the Hermitage in Russia, in Petersburg, and in Dresden. The paintings are, most of them anyway, quite difficult, some of them, to see. The Night Watch has a kind of double problem of being darker than it was intended to be. These light effects that seem to be from the wings or from some lights high above the picture, out of the picture, were really a kind of variable daylight that fell into the picture. By the way, these militia companies did not go out to practice or parade or anything at night. This had to be a day scene, just logically. Now, the Rijksmuseum has a complex conservation problem, which is the picture is not as legible as it could become if the dirty varnish can be removed without endangering the paint layers and not throwing the picture wildly out of balance in terms of dark light. So one problem is technical. The other problem is that it's the most famous thing in Holland, and everybody wants to come and see it. So they couldn't really take it off view the way they've done before when the picture needed conservation treatment. So they are now at this moment working on it. maybe not at this very moment, but day in and day out, while the public is in the gallery, the big long gallery at the center of the Rijksmuseum, but it's behind a great big glass box. It's in a box together with the people working on it, together with the equipment and so forth. And what they've done since, let's see, early spring, I think last year, 2019, has been to document it by new methods, ordinary photography, but also various kinds of scanning photography that allow you to see, without destroying anything, the distribution of elements in the picture that point to the pigments used. So they've wanted to learn what the really delicate places might be by knowing what the pigment in the paint is, and also to make a kind of clear, sharp map of the entire paint surface. There's more to be said about this. I'll stop, but I'll tell you it's going on. It's going to be going on for quite a while, as far as I can tell. I'm not sure what their new deadline is or their new point of arrival is because when the studies are done, then the cleaning will begin, depending on how extensive the work is. It'll be there for quite a while, and you can watch it while you're there, but you're probably not going to be there all that much unless you become completely hypnotized by the whole thing. What the Rijksmuseum has done has been to shoot a lot of video, and I'll do a lot of interviews and put up right away, week by week by week, a kind of progress report on its website. And it's very, very impressive. And you can spend many days catching up with this project. It's easy to find. It's rijksmuseum.nl, rijksmuseum.nl, and you'll see a flag on the first page probably saying, sending you to Operation Night Watch, one word, Operation Night Watch. You could even search on that and you'll find it. You'll go right to it. And you'll have a very good time. You'll learn a lot about the state of the art where technical photography is concerned.
That is incredible. So it's basically a live webcam of conservationists doing their job?
Yeah, it might be. It might be. I haven't actually seen long live webcam footage of the work. The work has not been so interesting so far because it's been mostly photographic documentation. But there are some surprises. I mean, we know that there are some feathers in some hats that we didn't see before. But we know that because that's the chemicals used for that particular foliage it was detected and so on. We will know a huge amount more, and we'll be able to come up with a far more elaborate digital reconstruction of the original state of the picture, we think anyway, than we ever had before. But it will make it a day scene, not a night scene. I mean, it's not going to be bright, but it will make it a little more, I think, believable that this never was intended as nighttime with stage lighting. This is daylight manipulated very adroitly by Rembrandt to do what he wants the light to do, pick out things that are of interest and leave the rest in the background, just as a stage lighting designer does. That's what Rembrandt does in the history paintings, and it's what he does here.
Yeah, when I studied photography and cinematography, they talked a lot about Rembrandt lighting, and Rembrandt has such a surgical skill with precision lighting that this painting is very confusing.
Yeah.
So now it all makes sense. Now that you've explained it.
I apologize.
No, this is wonderful. Now I think it also answers Rebecca Uletet's question, which was about his paintings darkening over time. So you have just answered her question. Thank you.
Yeah.
So let me see what other questions we have. Well, Paula, which I think she's referring to the Night Watch. We might need to get the Night Watch slide back up there, Josephine. Paula says there is a kind of focused cacophony in this painting with the action radiating out from the man in white, almost like the Jesus figure in one of the etchings we saw.
Oh, she's cheating. She's a writer. She's very perceptive. No, I mean, that's very good. Focused cacophony is Yeah, it's what you see. You see turbulence becomes excitement in one way. It allows things to seem to pop into view that arbitrarily that are not. Look at the man on the far right, the black hat above the drum in the black, turning to point to one of the figures, right? Now, what counts there is that he's the entry figure to the composition. He puts his arm right across the face of a guy in the background behind him. Huh? That guy doesn't count. He's one of the extras. There's another head in there too. But he definitely, his hand comes quite close to the face of, it's behind him, of course, by one of the guys who paid for his portrait. So he gets pulled out. Even though he's only half the size of the people up front, he gets special treatment. And the same is true all over the place. I'm just looking at the picture with you for a second here. You can see that's true all across the back. The people, the militiamen whose names we've got are there, and you can see variably lighted in a way that I think no normal unmanipulated daylight could possibly do. And it pulls together order, which, of course, geometrically comes to its apex in the form of the captain and the lieutenant, and then fans back. So the light works in that organizational way, as well as just as a kind of highlighting technique.
Barbara asks, what room is this painted in? But I think it's an exterior, no? Or is it inside a room?
Yeah, it's a town gate, and they're coming out of that arched opening.
Nevin asks if you have anything to say about the portrait of a young Jew in the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, Texas.
No. I mean, truly, no. If we had it on the screen, I could talk about it, but it's in the literature and you won't have any trouble finding it.
Okay. And Margot asks a question that we covered a lot over the last 5 weeks. So maybe we don't want to re-answer, but I'll just mention it. She says, did Rembrandt ever use a dealer, or did he just sell out of his own studio? Were there dealers that other artists used?
Yeah, a few. He starts off in Leiden, coming from Leiden to Amsterdam, and has a commercial relationship with a man called Hendrik Uilenburg. And his studio is in Uilenburg's house in a fashionable neighborhood. It's a sure thing that Uilenburg helped sell pictures from stock, I think, Rembrandt's studio, but also that he found people to come to Rembrandt and get the portraits painted. After Uilenburg, we don't know the name of anybody who was his dealer, and the supposition has been that he would have simply had people come to the studio and take a look. Some things might have been for sale, surely were. There was always the possibility of getting a portrait painted. And the possibility, which is really the thing we'd like to know the most, of a discussion with the artist of what kinds of pictures the client particularly likes or liked, if he'd seen other Rembrandts, what kinds of subjects appeal to him. That kind of client interview must have gone on to some extent, and that's what we would love to know. We have very little evidence to tie individual pictures. Well, we have some evidence to tie individual pictures with individual clients, but nothing to tell us what happened between the two people before the picture was painted. And there's no evidence that Rembrandt ever had a dealer as such. Yes, there were other people who sold pictures, but nobody that is documented dealing in works by the major contemporary artists, along with Rembrandt. Rembrandt wasn't the only important painter in Amsterdam, but art dealers on our model are evidently quite rare.
I wanted to ask you a little more about the elderly Mr. and Mrs. von Tripp or Tripp, sorry, not Von Tripp. I'm mixing them up with the Von Trapp family.
Yeah.
Maybe we could bring up those paintings. I don't know what number they are, but
Right. Well, sure.
oh, there we go.
Wow, that's great. Go. I tell you what. Go back. Yeah, go back to 119, could you? Yeah. Here's both of them. So yeah.
So you talked about them, their facial expressions, and they're sort of sad and taciturn. Is there any chance they're remorseful? Maybe because these days, when you're an arms dealer, it's not very in vogue to be to have that be the source of where your income came from.
Yeah, that's
You're thinking about that?
that's definitely the that's the 21st century speaking there. We can't help it. Here's a man of cannon foundries in Sweden, and whose family made a very big fortune in making armaments, and had a huge house with decorated on the outside. You can see it in Amsterdam. The Tripp house, I showed a picture of it. It's got sculptures on the outside with guns and ammo. So there was no apology made so far as the public image was concerned. And I think that Tripp himself, I don't see any remorse. Show the next slide, would you? Because I don't see it. I see, show 120 if you would. Well,
Josephine, can you go to 120? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I think the fact that his work brought death and destruction to some people who in his mind might well have deserved it. I can't believe for a minute in the 17th century that could show in his face. We project it. It can't have been there. Portraits just didn't do that. Portraits were not for confessions of guilt, or remorse, I think. There were people who did show guilt and remorse, but they were St. Peter, or Judas. Rembrandt knew how to do that.
Right.
But here, I think what he's displaying in his portrait, you can actually go back to his face if you would, please.
Sorry, bring back the slide.
Yeah. What he's doing here is what you expect of a 17th century portrait, which is to display, in a sense, his virtue and his situation in the world, both. In this case, I think it's kind of wisdom, accumulated wisdom. It's the stoic virtue of strength. I don't think there's anything in the way of psychological commentary here. Beyond, I think, this suggestion, I think this is true, that it's not simple, that this is a man who's may have more going on in his mind than sitting for a portrait, that there is some suggestion of complexity, but it's within the framework of a kind of dignified elder, wise with his years, and still strong.
Well, there is some ways that our 21st century lens does pertain to thinking about Rembrandt's paintings, and this I think will be the end of our Q&A for today. So just a reminder to everybody to RSVP for next week for the final lecture. But I noticed that you often in today's talk, you talked a lot about citizenship and duty, and those are prevalent in a lot of these images, people serving their civic duty. So this is November 1st.
Yes.
I want to remind our audiences, it is your civic duty to vote. And election day is November 3rd. So I hope everyone has already voted. If you have not, please come to the Hammer Museum and you can vote with us, or you can drop off your ballot there. I know that John Walsh was there. What day did you vote?
Oh, I don't know, a week ago or so. Yeah, I wanted to be sure. Anyway, it's the most elegant polling place you've ever seen, with the nicest people.
So you can even call up the Hammer and they'll tell you how many people are in line. But I recommend not waiting until Tuesday, November 3rd. So you can go in today, you can go in tomorrow, and if not, get there early on Tuesday morning, but do your civic duty and vote. And thank you, John Walsh, again for giving us this beautiful lecture series. It's absolutely incredible.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody. Stay healthy. See you next week.
We'll see you.